fully aware that it's been a long session and we're going to go straight into lunch very soon. I just want to allow us to have a couple of questions. I invite all the speakers to just come up and maybe just stand up if you want. And I'll take questions, and then if there's a question for a speaker, I'll take the questions all together in one group. If there's a question for a speaker, then I'll be looking for a question for a different speaker, just so we get a bit of variety. And we'll have just a few minutes of Q&A actually before we have to break for lunch. So would anyone like to start with a question for any of either the speakers or the virtual presenters as well? There's a question over here. Yep.
This is a question for Stefan and I've forgotten the lady's name.
Jenny.
Relating to Cameroon. I worked in Cameroon some time ago. My name's Colin Barnes. I used to teach in Dar es Salaam, Tanzania. And it was obvious that there were a lot of, we're talking about biodiversity, a lot of products, natural products in African countries that are not getting the value added that they should do. And the example here, I think, of Cameroon, near Mount Cameroon, is Prunus africana, which is a tree where the bark is used to produce medicines to treat prostate cancer. Now, the problem there is that the transformation of this product, the bark, into medical imports, medical products, is carried out in Belgium. And the issue there, of course, is how does Africa capture and retain the intellectual and also value added from natural products because of the biodiversity, which is vast in African countries. I'm thinking here of Prunus africana, though. Thank you.
Thank you. Is there another question? There's one right at the back, and then we'll take one at the front.
I think my question is directed to Babatunde. Yeah. You highlight ancient innovations, and I think there's this idea that they cannot be matched to what, let's say Europe has produced, or, you talk of the Egyptian pyramids, you talk of, or the example that you had of the furnace there, and maybe the modern type of furnace that we see. How do we change that narrative, or how can that type of invention be appreciated in its own right? Because I think there's always that comparison of this is great, because maybe it can do more than maybe that small furnace you had. And I think that might be the idea why we do not appreciate those ancient inventions. How is that narrative sort of coming and changing?
Thank you. And there's just, is there a different speaker? Yes. Yes, so there's just the microphone's coming, 1 second.
My question goes to Lucia. There's this concern about increasing use of plastics and their environmental impact. So regarding the face shields that were produced mass for this for your project, have you considered also the environmental implications and possibly thinking about using new design materials that are environmentally more sustainable?
Great. I'm just going to check if my one last question, if there's a question to any of the virtual speakers, assuming that they're online. Tabitha, I'm not sure. David is online. So David's online, if there's a question for David, but if not, we'll turn to the panel to answer these questions. Okay, great. I think we'll go ahead and maybe take those questions in order, and I think you're all mic'd up, maybe not Jenny and Stefan. So Jenny and Stefan, do you want to take the first question?
Yeah, sure. I think that is exactly the purpose of having these, the local manufacturing in place. So the kind of point where we started is that it's difficult to innovate with biotechnology if you're having to wait for 2 to 3 months for the enzymes and reagents and other things to be delivered. And so it kind of means that, particularly, for example, for natural products, if you wanted to produce those in a biotechnology way, as opposed to getting them from a tree, first of all, you have to understand exactly what you're dealing with, which may not be known. So that's involving research. And then the second is that you're probably talking about a whole metabolic pathway there that would have to be recreated in a bacteria or a yeast or one of these standard kind of biotechnology chassis. And that's a lot of engineering work that is totally possible. There's lots of papers produced on natural product synthesis using organisms, and sometimes that's a useful way of doing it and sometimes it's not. But ultimately it's quite a complex process. And so to have the ability to do the metabolic engineering and kind of the number of iterations that will be needed to reach a point where you can produce that, it really is difficult to do in an environment of reagent scarcity where if something goes wrong, you have to then wait 2 months for something new to be delivered. So the idea really was here kind of taking the fundamental tools for doing the science and trying to make them more readily available quickly. But I think ultimately that was sort of a catalyst. So by embedding, recombinant protein production, which as far as we're aware, the Maboa lab is the only lab we've found in Cameroon doing recombinant protein production, to have those tools available as a starting point and then as a platform to kind of build on and maybe do some metabolic engineering for natural products. Because I think that cycle, that whole discovery kind of innovation, commercialization cycle should absolutely be able to happen more locally, because the pattern that you mentioned is extremely common. You also see this in biology. We use a lot of extremophiles, organisms that grow in salt lakes or in extreme temperature environments, and quite often those environments are far from the places that end up commercializing the use. And then you also have this very kind of toxic publication record where the collaborators from low and middle income countries kind of get credited for finding the organism in the first place, but then they actually the amount of contribution that's able to be made in terms of the analysis and commercialization is limited, but really not limited due to talent or skill, but limited due to resource availability. And so trying to kind of break out of that is difficult, but I definitely think it's where we want to head, so that you can do that. I don't know, Steph, if you have any.
Yes, I think to add to that, part of the work we do is actually to do something and have something to say to our political leaders, policy makers, because the system in Cameroon particularly is that you need to show the importance of what you do. And part of the advantage, or one of the advantages we've seen in our work is that people are able to see, like, okay, we have concrete products to show and to say that, okay, this is the innovation we came up with. It's a bit more easy for political leaders, policymakers to say, okay, we need to invest in that, we need to accompany this kind of innovations. So maybe that's the addition I can make to the question.
So Kingsley and Abidemi, I'm not sure if you want Kingsley to answer that question, Abidemi, as you suggested he might have to.
Okay, thank you. How do we change the narrative? I will approach it from 2 points of view, the academic's point of view and real world, because the academic and the real world, they're kind of on different paths. Many a times we make all this noise in our publication and it just ends there, and doesn't really translate to anything out there. So from the academic perspective, I think we have to rethink how we publish and where we publish, and also what we publish. For me, of course, not for everybody, but for people who has to do with who have to deal with the past, things that has to do with the past. For example, in 2017, I published an article in the Journal of Black Studies, published in the US. And when I look through this Journal of Black Studies, most of the article you see there has to do with, black incarceration, police brutality, Black Lives Matters, and all those racial discrimination and all those stuff. I was like, okay, is this all we can say about Africa? Is this all we can learn from, from the past? Then I decided to publish that article there because most people in my area, we either publish in the journal of, let's say, material science, archaeometry, petrography and stuff like that. But I felt like people also in the kind of popular area also need to understand what we do, So in Journal of Black Study, for example, I made a case like, okay, the African story is not only about racial discrimination, it's not only about racism and the colonialism, it's also about invention and innovation, and we need to push that story out. That is on the academic side. And of course, on the real world side, everything in the real world has a history. There's nothing you want to do today that doesn't have a history. For example, if you are trying to rethink a kind of educational curriculum, look into the past. What are the things in the past that will help us to understand the present and plan for the future? Most of the things we talk about or what we do in archaeology or history, for example, in Africa, or let me say Nigeria in particular, history is not being taught in most of secondary schools and primary schools as well. So how do we know what, for example, you want to establish an industry and you're not looking at the history of that industry? I mean, there's always something to learn from the past. So from the side, I think it's similar to what my colleague just talked about in terms of trying to put this information out there for the policymakers to understand that, oh, wait a minute, when you're talking about developing extractive industry, there is a history to it, and there is something we can learn from the past as to how it was being done. Of course, I'm not saying we should rely on definitely the past techniques and the technology, but of course we can learn and improve from it.
Okay, thank you very much. On the question of changing the narrative, I think that is what we are doing already by giving such talks and carrying out such research, and thanks to Cambridge Africa Abdurrahman. Now, one thing we have to understand is, by the time people keep talking down on you and making you feel that you know nothing, it kind of demoralizes you and you feel you cannot think outside the box. So by giving such talks, doing such research, we tend to remind Africans that, hey, your ancestors did this in the past, so why can't you do better? So it kind of inspires the African man or the African woman to think outside the box and to believe that they can actually do better. So I think actually what we are doing is already changing the narrative. Thank you.
Great. And then Lucia, the last question for you.
Great. Thanks very much for your question. It's something that we constantly discussed as a team. I think we thought about it in a few different ways. So, firstly, we were inherently limited by the functionality of the product itself. So we tried as best as possible to reduce the amount of potentially harmful materials that we were using. But when you look at the design of the face shield with the clear PET front, there's only a limited number of materials you could have used. Glass would have been really heavy, would have been energy intensive to produce, and just not appropriate for the type of use. So that firstly limited it, and the way that we thought about it then was just trying to focus on making sure that we could establish cleaning protocols so that these face shields could be reused as much as possible, so they weren't single use. And then also thinking about it from a material separation point of view. So there were different components to the face shield, but how could we actually ensure that that they could be separated easily at the end of life for disposal, for recyclability. We also looked at changing the design of the face shield so that we actually eliminated some of the foam strip, which is a difficult material to deal with at the end of life. But we also had to balance this with the materials that were available locally. So when we were trialing that design, it relied on having a slightly thicker plastic sheet. And that worked fine at the start, but then we ran out of that material in Malawi, so we had to shift back to this design using foam. So I guess that's just to say that actually it's very difficult to try and grapple with these decisions, and that we were constantly trying to think about short-term, long-term.
Great. So we are a bit over time, and there is a really packed schedule. We have a lunch ahead. I'm going to ask you to all in a second join me in thanking all of our speakers here as well as virtually for what has been a great set of talks. So thank you straight away. I'm going to abuse my chance just to say, I think what I really took away from this panel, and it's a really diverse set of talks, but it's just this idea of rethinking history, not because we have to go back and correct the historical record, although that is very important, but just as I think we heard from Kingsley and Abidemi, that the inspiration comes from this sense of a long heritage of invention and bringing that forth into the present. And I think the talks today really struck, Professor Samba, some of the things that you are calling for, this idea that this is about the global health and the global south as well, that out of disruption and necessity comes tremendous opportunity, the ability to innovate, not just the innovation itself, but the way we think about innovation, create the possibility conditions for innovation, and then suddenly start to do things with things like clean energy that are, of global significance if they can come off. So lots of exciting things going on, and a real maturation of what Cambridge Africa is all about, I have to say, looking back and looking forward ahead. So thank you, everyone, for a long morning session. We're going to break for lunch. I don't know if there's any announcement there, but I'll leave that with Tabitha. And thank you very much, and thanks again to the panel.